Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Emily Tonorezos, and I'm Director of the Office of Cancer Survivorship at the National Cancer Institute. I'm going to be talking to you today about a number of issues related to cancer survivorship under the umbrella of sowing the seeds of survivorship. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means. So I like to start with our definition of a cancer survivor. We say that an individual is considered a cancer survivor from the time of diagnosis through the balance of life. And there are many types of survivors, including those who are living with cancer and those who are free of cancer. There are a number of reasons why we use this definition. First of all, I will just say from a scientific perspective, it is much easier to try to count people with a history of a diagnosis of cancer than to try to figure out whether someone is finished with treatment or on treatment, or perhaps off treatment but expected to go back on treatment, or whether we would have different definitions for different cancer types. It's much easier from a scientific perspective to have one definition that says it starts at the time of diagnosis and to stick with that for all different cancer types and circumstances. But the most important reason we actually use this definition is because this is the way that the advocacy community defined cancer survivor when they wrote out this definition a very long time ago. The Office of Cancer Survivorship was founded in 1996. And at that time, actually, the cancer survivorship advocacy community had been working for many years in this area. And they are the ones who told us to use this definition of a cancer survivor. Of course, when it comes to individuals, people may or may not resonate with the word survivor. And I will just say from the perspective of the Office of Cancer Survivorship, we do not insist that people use this term when it applies to themselves. What I have here is a quote from a young woman who had been diagnosed with more than one cancer. And this is what she said: "I strongly identify as a breast cancer survivor. It's this seminal part of my young adulthood, but I feel differently about survivor in the context of having a glioblastoma, which is an incurable grade 4 brain tumor. So I identify as a breast cancer survivor, but a brain cancer patient." And so in that acknowledgement that the word survivor may not resonate with every individual, we also understand that there are a lot of different ways to think about survivors. You can think about a group of survivors who have been diagnosed with early stage cancer, who are being treated with curative intent. You can think about survivors in a group of people who've been diagnosed with advanced or metastatic cancer, or perhaps were diagnosed with an early stage cancer that progressed to metastatic cancer, where the goal of care is to treat with the intent to prolong life. And then you can think about people who've been diagnosed with or who progress to end-stage cancer, where the goal of life is end-of-life care. And this is a group that we also consider to be cancer survivors. Now, I've told you what it means to be a cancer survivor, but I want to try to explain a little bit about cancer survivorship. So when we talk about survivorship and the Office of Cancer Survivorship, what we mean is a state of being. And survivorship includes the perspectives, the needs, the health, and the physical, psychological, social, and economic challenges experienced by people and caregivers after a cancer diagnosis. So we think of survivorship as this cloud. It includes needs, perspectives, challenges of all different kinds, and overall health, and different ways we can think about health as well. So I've mentioned a few times my office, the Office of Cancer Survivorship, and I wanted to share with you our mission: to support research that both examines and addresses the long and short-term physical, psychological, social, and economic effects of cancer and its treatment among pediatric and adult survivors of cancer and their families. Now, you may notice that research is front and center in our mission. Of course, we are part of the National Cancer Institute, and the purview of the National Cancer Institute is research. And so the primary purpose of our office is to support research. We do a lot of other things, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that later. But the central part of our effort is to support investigation and survivorship. And we think of cancer survivorship research as work that seeks to enhance the health and well-being of all cancer survivors and caregivers. And when you look at this figure, we call this the survivorship research rainbow. You can see that cancer survivorship research includes a lot of different types of work and a lot of different types of investigators. And this is actually foundational to our field. We are not just behavioral scientists or health services researchers. We are a group of people coming from all different backgrounds, from all different training, who are working together for the benefit of cancer survivors and their families. So when you look across this rainbow, you can see a lot of different research fields represented and also levels of influence, meaning we can be doing work at the individual survivor, at the level of the care team or the healthcare providers, at the healthcare system, in the community, on the payer level, or even at the policy level. And that's all considered survivorship research. So in our efforts to support survivorship research, it's been very important for us to both define it and then to try to quantify what the National Cancer Institute is supporting in survivorship research. One of the reasons this is important goes back to that research rainbow. Survivorship research is supported through lots of different places at the NCI. My office, the Office of Cancer Survivorship, actually does not directly fund research. We do a lot to try to promote and support research, but we don't directly fund it. And so that means that if we want to get a hold on what the NCI is funding in survivorship research and where the gaps in that funding might be, we have to have a method for calculating, counting, and keeping track of what NCI or NIH more broadly is supporting in the area of cancer survivorship research. A big part of this effort is something that we do in an ongoing way, which is the survivorship grant portfolio analysis. We published the first set of our work in this area in 2022. And for that publication, what we did was look at survivorship grants across NIH from fiscal years 2017 to 2021. And the intention of this analysis was to try to identify some of those gaps that could be areas for future research. We looked at all different kinds of research and project grants, including these different mechanisms. Some are called R, some are U. We looked at PO1s and training grant, SC1s and SC3s. We looked at research focused on survivors as well as informal caregivers. And we looked for studies addressing secondary or tertiary prevention for cancer and cancer side effects, assessment or surveillance of cancer effects and treatment toxicities, intervention studies to address cancer and its treatment, and health services research by providers, patients, and caregivers. What we found is that the most common grant type is the R01 mechanism, followed by the R21 mechanism. Some of you may already know that the R01 is the most common type of grant given out by the NCI. These are usually 5-year grants, and they are usually investigator initiated, meaning an outside investigator has an idea for a study and submits their proposal to the NCI, which then goes through peer review. The second most common grant type was the R21. Those are considered preliminary studies or pilot studies, and that's a smaller grant. We had a lot of studies with multiple PIs. Actually, more than a third of our grants are multiple PI grants. What that means is that survivorship science very often requires scientists from more than one background. When you submit a multiple PI grant, you have to make a strong case for why you really need more than one person to lead that grant. And the most common reason for needing a multiple PI is because you have principal investigators with complementary expertise around a survivorship question. So it was nice to see this very high proportion of multiple PI grants. It also reflects the type of science that a lot of survivorship science is. And then we had almost a third of our grants supporting early stage investigators. When we dug a little deeper into the study type, we saw that about 60% of the portfolio is intervention studies and about 40% is observational studies. Within those interventions, we see that the most common intervention is around psychosocial or supportive care. The second most common was lifestyle or health behaviors. And the third most common was care delivery. we found only 4% of all studies that were implementation science grants. And when we looked at outcomes, we saw that the most common outcomes were physiologic. This means things like symptoms or signs, maybe biologic measures, or outcomes like hip fracture. The second most common outcome was psychosocial. So that could be something like experiencing distress or symptoms of depression. The third most common was health-related quality of life. We have a lot of quality of life studies in our portfolio, followed by healthcare utilization, and then health behaviors or health promotion outcomes. So those are things like physical activity, healthy diet, and skin or sun protection measures. I was asked specifically to dig a little bit into the question of long-term survivorship. One of the greatest acknowledgements of the advances that have been made in cancer diagnosis, treatment, and supportive care are the millions of people who are living in the United States with a history of a diagnosis of cancer. I want to bring your attention to this figure, which is actually a new version of a figure which you may have seen in the past. We just published this prevalence paper in JNCI a few months ago. And what we did is something that has not been there before, is this brown bar, people who have been living 25 or more years from the time of diagnosis. It's an unbelievable thing to think about. But what you see is that that brown bar is growing, and it's growing quickly. So as we expect to see the number of cancer survivors go up in time in the United States, we also expect the proportion represented by those 25 plus year survivors to go up. Actually, historically, when we think about long-term survivors, we are talking about people who are 5 or more years from diagnosis. It's funny now that I highlight 25 or more years, but actually anyone who's 5 or more years from diagnosis is considered a long-term survivor. In 2016, an ASCO survey identified long-term cancer survivors as a key research gap in cancer survivorship research. Additionally, those portfolio analyses that I pointed out found that more studies are needed to examine outcomes for this growing population of long-term cancer survivors, including long-term follow-up studies. In that paper, we said, we risk being ill-informed and unprepared to manage these individuals' future care. In 2019, NCI convened the Cancer Survivorship Workshop to identify evidence gaps and next steps to advance cancer survivorship. At this meeting, participants identified cross-cutting recommendations, including the need for long-term follow-up studies. So as you can see, this has been an area that we've been highlighting for quite a while. On this slide, I'm showing you some of those places that long-term cancer survivors have been called out or highlighted, including in our 2019 meeting paper and in our portfolio analysis. But what actually is NCI funding on long-term cancer survivors? So when you go to the NCI website, you can look up funding opportunities, both active and expired, related to long-term cancer survivors. And what we see is that there have been only 2 funding opportunities that have explicitly focused on long-term cancer survivors. And these were in 1997 and in 2003. The 1997 initiative funded 16 studies, and in 2003, there were 17 studies funded. When we looked at the kinds of studies that were funded under these opportunities, we used iSearch to create these graphics highlighting keywords from the title, abstract, and specific aims from the funded grants. In 1997, the 16 grant topics included 8 grants on quality of life, 4 grants on prostate cancer, and 1 grant each on cardiac, premature menopause, and genetic mutations. In 2004, the 17 long-term cancer survivor grants topics included 8 grants on breast cancer, 5 grants on physical activity, 5 grants on pediatric cancer survivors, 3 grants related to the metabolic syndrome, and 2 on older adults. When we look more closely at the NIH Cancer Survivorship Grant portfolio to try to examine those studies that include long-term survivors. We found 62 grants funded from 2017 to 2023. This graph shows you new grants by funding year on long-term survivors. And there have been a few NOFOs, or notice of funding opportunities, that seem to fund a number of long-term survivorship grants. For example, the STAR Act RFA research to reduce morbidity and improve care for pediatric, adolescent, and young adult cancer survivors funded 8 grants in long-term cancer survivorship. When we look at in detail at what is currently funded in the NIH survivorship grant portfolio related to long-term survivors, we found that 50% of the current grants are focused on pediatric survivors, 19% are on AYA survivors, and 6% are on older adult survivors. And when we excluded the pediatric grants and looked at what cancer types are represented, we found 21% of the studies are on breast cancer, 21% are on lymphoma or leukemia survivors, and 7% are on colorectal cancer survivors. I will say that it's not surprising that a lot of these long-term follow-up studies on long-term survivors are related to that pediatric and AYA survivor population. That is a group that has been working in the area of survivorship research for a long time, and we know that pediatric survivors, by virtue of the time in life that they were diagnosed, are more likely to represent long-term survivors. That said, you can see that even once we remove those pediatric grants, there are still a number of notable gaps in our current portfolio. When we dug in a little bit further, we see that most of these studies are observational studies. In this slide, you can see the focus of the grant, including care delivery, health promotion, infrastructure, and methods. When we looked at outcomes, we see again that physiologic is the most common category of outcome, followed by biomarkers and psychosocial outcomes. And when we've been thinking about what we should be doing in this area, we have a few potential next steps in mind. First, we're going to dig even deeper into the portfolio. We're going to dig even deeper into funding opportunities to see how long-term cancer survivorship issues are included and described. We have an ongoing exploration of the scientific literature, and we're really interested in how NCI data resources are being leveraged to study long-term cancer survivorship. We talked a lot in this meeting so far about cancer survivorship and survivorship research. And I just wanted to bring us back for a moment to what really makes this work important and special. My observation has been that many people who are working in cancer survivorship have either a connection to a cancer survivor or have had an interaction with a cancer survivor that have influenced their scientific work. This is a quote from Erin Van Blargen. She's one of our grantees, and she said, "Cancer survivors' experiences and perspectives have a profound influence on my program of research." Lori Sakota, who's a cancer epidemiologist, wrote, "My commitment to advancing etiologic and translational research on lung cancer is driven by the loss of my father to the disease, now over 30 years ago, and the recognition that lung cancer continues to touch the lives of many as it remains the leading cause of cancer mortality." I will say that when it comes to the Office of Cancer Survivorship, we feel extremely driven and motivated to work in this area. We, as I mentioned, are primarily here to support funding opportunities and survivorship research, but we do a lot of other things, including meeting with advocates, speaking with members of Congress, conducting our own research, hosting informational webinars, and supporting investigators directly through networking and building collaborations. One of the things that I've been interested in recently is this idea of whole person survivorship care. I'm not sure if you know about the concept of whole person care, But this is the type of care which says where you aren't just addressing the bodily needs of a person or even the behavior and lifestyle needs, the social and emotional needs, but also the spiritual and mental needs. This is a vision of taking care of cancer survivors that includes all of the context and society and community factors that can influence how a person feels and what is contributing to their health and what ultimately supports joy and meaning. We actually have an open request for information related to whole person survivorship care. And if this is an area that's interesting to you, or if you want to have a say in the work that NCI is supporting in the area of whole person care, please come to the NCI OCS website. It's survivorship.cancer.gov. And you will see the request for information there, and you can click on it and put in your thoughts about what we should be doing in this area. Along those lines, we also have on the website an area that's called Survivor Stories. Right now, there are 18 cancer survivor stories on our Cancer Survivor Stories page. And in the past year, there have been more than 11,000 page views of the cancer survivors' main page alone, not including page views of the individual stories. This page includes both written stories and some short videos, and we continue to add to the stories. I just want to say that when I started at NCI, this area of our website was already in existence. And in fact, it was the most popular place on the website for people to visit. And so we have been working to enhance and update it ever since then. One of the stories there is from this man, Bob. He has a video as well as his written out story. And he said, there is not one right way through cancer, and you have to be aware of what makes sense for you. I wanted to tell you just a few things we are doing in terms of funding opportunities. As I mentioned, we don't hold grants in the Office of Cancer Survivorship, but we do promote funding opportunities and support investigators who are applying to these types of funding opportunities. These are some examples of recent funding opportunities here at NCI related to cancer survivors. Number one, improving care and outcomes for cancer survivors from sexual and gender minority populations. Disparities affecting healthcare utilization and health outcomes among childhood cancer survivors, pragmatic trials across the cancer control continuum, research to understand and address the survivorship needs of individuals living with advanced cancer, and addressing the primary care needs of cancer survivors. The other thing I mentioned that we do is a lot of events. The Office of Cancer Survivorship has hosted numerous webinars as part of the OCS Director Series, the OCS New Investigator Series, and other survivorship-related events. In June, which was National Cancer Survivors Month, we hosted this webinar called Survivor Voices, the vital role of survivors in advancing cancer survivorship research. What we heard from these 4 people is how their own cancer diagnosis and treatment experience has influenced the work that they're doing and the way that they have turned their experience into an opportunity for advocacy. That was in June, but if you go to our website, you can watch the recording. Coming up in October, we have a webinar on advancing research through cancer survivorship clinical programs. At this webinar, we will have 6 representatives from clinical programs across the country who all wrote perspective pieces in the Journal of Cancer Survivorship special section on the clinical programs for cancer survivorship. We also do a series of talks called the New Investigator Series. As I mentioned before, our investigators in survivorship come from a lot of different backgrounds, have a lot of different experiences, training programs, perspectives, and it can be very difficult to have a career of sustained research in survivorship. There are some challenges that are universal that affect everyone who's trying to get their funded research program going. And then there are some challenges that are specific to survivorship researchers. And so we have some middle career and senior investigators in survivorship talk about how they made it work. This was a recent talk from Ann Kirchhoff, who talked about navigating and surviving the twists and turns of survivorship funding and research. And her talk is also available on our website. If you are someone who's trying to find your way in survivorship research, or maybe you're looking for some inspiration or trying to find out how other people have made it happen, this series is a really nice place to look for those resources. And finally, I want to close with some words from Annie, a ovarian cancer survivor. She said, "Life is sweet." And I think the point of surviving is to live it, to live your life and help others if you can. Thank you.